Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com, where you'll find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic discussed right here on the podcast. San Antonio Express News writer Sarah Chavey joins me now for the first time to discuss why some San Antonio residents have used more than 1 million gallons of water so far this year. That's just part of the story, though. We're going to talk a lot about water usage, a little bit of the history of that in San Antonio, and some ways that maybe you could use less water in the future. So, Sarah Chavey, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thanks for your interest in this topic.
Oh, of course. I mean, obviously, Texas is very dry in a lot of areas, just like some parts of the United States. But, there's been some things recently. Wildfires, specifically in California, have been getting a lot of play. Wildfires in lots of different parts of the United States, parts of the world. Texas has obviously had its droughts here and there over the course of history. And San Antonio specifically has had issues with things like this in the past. So this is obviously a very good topic. But then specifically with climate change, the costs of water, everything that can be attached to that, this is a really important topic. I'm wondering, though, before we get started, Sarah, why specifically now is this something that you've been looking into?
Well, it's a lot of what you just mentioned with what's going on in the world. It was actually more of a team decision than me personally. But it was looking at, it has been a very dry year in San Antonio. These months in particular, July and August, are some of the really dry ones, the times that people kind of start looking over to their neighbors' yards and wondering how they have such green grass and, how that's all working. So it's a story that we've kind of looked at in the past. We've put in these open records requests to the San Antonio water system in previous years to see who kind of is at the top of those water charts. And it had been several years since we'd looked at it. So we wanted to see what had changed and how it was relevant this year as we deal with kind of drought restrictions.
And so we'll get to a lot of those things that you just mentioned. But generally speaking, Sarah, what has been that water situation you briefly mentioned for San Antonio this past year?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of different drought restrictions. At the end of May, the San Antonio water system activated stage 1 restrictions, which essentially mean that customers can only water their lawns on certain days with a sprinkler or irrigation system. And they're limited to a certain amount of hours. And then partway through June, we got into stage 2 restrictions, which are obviously a little more strict, and those just sort of limit those hours of outdoor watering even more, among other restrictions. So it's nothing super serious. I don't think meteorologists are particularly worried about where we are, but definitely worth trying to conserve water and definitely not abusing it.
And obviously that would be the beginning of something that could get even worse, stage 1, stage 2. So something, once again, not to create any panic, but something to definitely pay attention to. And then so now moving into water and talking about the trends, the consumption trends that you found while researching this article that once again is available online at expressnews.com. How does that compare with the past and the recent past for the San Antonio area?
Yeah, so over the past 20 years, water consumption has actually gone down. And from what the folks over at the San Antonio Water System told me, a lot of that is partly can be traced back to how we're using computers to measure water and predict it and provide feedback to customers. So those computers have allowed officials to figure out what is taking up the most water, and then they're able to work to improve the efficiency of those systems. So years ago, toilets were one of those focuses. Some toilets would use 9 gallons per flush, and others would use less, but they might still be inefficient because people might, flush twice to make up for it. And so SAWS, the San Antonio Water System, just studied it extensively. They called themselves toilet experts after this, and they really figured out the best way to do it. And they went in and they were, in the past, 20 years, they have replaced 750,000 toilets commercially and residentially. That was just kind of one of the first things that they saw that was an obvious issue. So the new toilets can use as few as 1.28 gallons per flush, which is, significantly lower than that 9 gallons per flush they were starting with. And that was something they figured out with the computers. Now they've sort of switched their focus to outdoor usage. Irrigation is typically the number one thing that separates those low water users from the ones that might end up on that high water usage list. And it's a little bit harder for the folks at SAWS to work with because it can't simply be replaced just like a toilet would. It requires a little more back and forth with the homeowners. And so SAWS has been working on that by replacing, encouraging people to replace parts of lawn that are too difficult or impossible even to water. They set up coupon systems to encourage people to substitute patioscapes for water-needy landscapes, things like that. So that's kind of where the trends are going from changing those toilets, which can be easily swapped out, to now trying to find the more efficient ways to do things that we're probably always going to do, like watering our lawns.
So yeah, it definitely sounds like San Antonio is trying to be more efficient, encourage people to use less water when possible. And your article actually mentions that San Antonio is generally considered a low water usage city, and actually probably the longest running traditional historical water conservation efforts that date back to around 1992 or so. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that low water using does not necessarily mean that we are using a lower amount of water than people in other cities. There's really no way to compare San Antonio to other cities across the state or even the country, just because our climates and the amount of rain we receive are so different. And so we are called a low water using city just because we have put forth so much effort toward water conservation. And that does go back to 1992, which is kind of when this began on a national level. So according to the San Antonio water system, they became aggressive with water conservation efforts pretty immediately. So they started with those toilets, and now they're working on the irrigation systems. And they just described themselves kind of as cutting edge in terms of combating water waste. And they've continued that. So now they're kind of combating as the city grows and more people are coming here. They don't necessarily know what to expect in terms of how their lawns should look. And so the San Antonio water system has continued to reiterate their messages, even though it feels, very repetitive to them to be saying, don't water your lawns all the time. They're realizing that people are coming in either from the military or, through some other avenue, and they don't know what to expect here, and they don't understand that you can't necessarily water your lawn here the same that you might up north. So it's just things like that they've continued to do.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. San Antonio, as we've talked about here in the NDEath podcast, growing very quickly, predicted to have quite a huge amount of growth. I think the data is around like 2040. The city, the metropolitan area is trying to work on infrastructure, trying to make sure that there will be adequate roads so that there's not just traffic gridlock. Obviously, water usage is something else that has to be thought about. But if you move to the San Antonio metropolitan area from somewhere else, you might not know just right off the bat what you should be doing with your lawn, as in what's reasonable, what's going to match the rest of the area. And that's something that could be some very useful information to avoid, a big bill, to avoid just, more water than might be necessary for your neighbors in the area that you live in. For one reason or another, some people, some commercial corporations are using quite a lot of water in San Antonio. And what's interesting is they actually have a listing of some of the biggest users, biggest offenders, however you want to brand that. Tell me about those two lists for residential and for commercial water usage.
Yeah, so there's two different lists, but you can kind of split up the properties that are included on those lists into the three different groups. So I would group them as the residential properties that might have landed on those top offender lists before, the residential properties that are likely, one time only landing on that list, maybe it was an accident. And then there's the commercial properties, which you really can't necessarily compare too much to the residential properties. So the first group are the residential ones that they've landed there before. A lot of them have large properties. They might have pools. They might even have vanity lakes. And they have the means to keep those lawns and those landscapes green if they want. And that is a perfectly legal thing for them to do as long as they are following drought restrictions. And so if they want to do that, and they might do that year after year, and they end up on this list year after year. And it's possible that they have leaks. We reached out to all of them that landed on the list, and we didn't get a response from the majority. Nobody said, yes, I just like to have a green yard. So it's possible that all of these were accidents. But as the San Antonio water system officials mentioned, they're often repeat offenders. And so this is typically maybe just something that they like to spend their money on. They also might just not have any idea how much water they're using. Some of the high pressure irrigation systems can put out, 30 to 35 gallons per minute. And if you have 30 or 35 of those around your yard, that just adds up so quickly. So the second list is the residential properties that kind of landed on that list accidentally. Those are the people who had major leaks, and many of them didn't even realize they had these leaks for up to several months. Sometimes the water just kind of sinks right back into the ground, especially in certain parts of the city. And so these people don't realize what's happening until they get a bill from the San Antonio water system saying, it's twice as much than in normal months. And then they contact the system and find out that they're using way more water. And typically these people just feel terrible about them. I did hear back from a couple of them, and they just called and they're like, we tried to be so conservative and we feel terrible that we were abusing the water system. It was definitely not intentional. So then the third group is the corporations and the companies, and they're pretty much just going to be on that list no matter what. SAWS gave us a top 20 list, and those companies are pretty much the same every year. And it's not that they're abusing the water, it's just that they require so much water for what they're doing. So the number one on the corporation list was the HEB production facility, and they're using that water for production and for food safety and for their bakery and, a number of other things. And obviously people want their food to be clean when it arrives. And so they definitely work to reduce the amount of water they use, and they try to reuse water because that also helps save them money in the long run. So they're kind of actively working with the San Antonio water system like most of the other companies on that list.
Yeah, from the commercial aspect, that list did seem to be more of they're just going to use water no matter what. I can't remember specifically which one, but one of them had actually, I think, doubled its production, but still was using the same amount of water. And one of them was using water for some washing purposes, but they had to reuse it. It was like a 20-step process. So as opposed to the residential, which may be an accident, which may be, hey, we can use the water, we're going to pay for it, we're not breaking the law. It did seem, at least from the commercial side, many, if not all of them, were probably using as much water as they just needed for the purposes that they were using it for.
Yeah, and I do want to correct one small thing. The one you were talking about with the 20-step truck washing process, that was actually not a required reuse. That was something that they initiated in order to save water. They were just required to go through a 23-step process to clean their truck, and that requires so much water that eventually they started saving the last round of water that they used and using it in their first step for the next set of trucks that they had to clean. So that was actually a conservation effort on their part, even though they had to sort of work with, the FDA to follow certain regulations.
That's why I'm speaking to the expert. Thank you for that correction. That's very much appreciated. Before we move on to a few more quick questions before we say goodbye, Sarah, I'm wondering about this list itself. Usually when it comes to not having your information thrown out there, a lot of things, can be public record when it comes to breaking the law or some sort of, actions that you're taking. But just as a normal citizen, I would just assume that, my water usage or other utility usage might not be broadcast out there for everyone to know. But these are lists that the city puts out that people can have access to.
Yeah, so they don't necessarily put it out. They're not, posting it on their Facebook and Twitter accounts and trying to publicize it. We put in an open records request, and as a city company, they have to comply with that and they have to give us that information. I will note there were a few things that were redacted from the list, so people can opt to have their name left out of the list, or others opted to have, their address left out. And most people, I imagine, don't think to do that. I would guess that some of the people that have done that are either well-known figures or maybe have had their name on the list before, and that's kind of what triggered them to notify the San Antonio water system that they would like that information redacted. But for the most part, this is very public information, and it was, just one open records request away.
And then, so as we've already discussed, in a lot of cases, you can pay for water and you can kind of use it however you'd like. So when you make it on these lists for 1 year or multiple years, not really going to be a consequence for that, correct?
No, definitely not. Already the companies are working with the San Antonio water system. So they've got working relationships and pretty much nothing happens to them. The residents do receive a notice saying you are on this list. And it's not saying we're going to punish you, we're going to fine you, please stop. It's just saying you're on this list. If you would like to try and save some water and participate in conservation efforts, here are some suggestions. And if they are interested, then the San Antonio water system will send someone out and they'll do a consultation and try and figure out how they might be able to, replace their irrigation system or redo some of their yard to be a little more more of a patio scape and a little less water needy. But there's definitely not a punishment for being on the list.
And then finally, before we say goodbye, Sarah, we've talked about some reasons already that you found for perhaps some water wastage. We could quickly talk about more that we haven't gotten to yet, but then also some tips to conserve water that people might not be thinking of.
Yeah, so some of the typical reasons for water wastage, those are leaks. So those usually happen in, your pool, your irrigation system, your sprinklers, your toilets, and usually that's just if you notice your bill is so much bigger than it used to be, that's probably one of the reasons. In terms of conserving water, you can kind of go about it in one of three different ways. You can either just restrict your water use, or you can change up the way that you set up your lawn. And then third, you can just try and improve the efficiency of your current systems. And SAWS provides a number of resources to help out with that. They have a sort of a Pinterest-esque web page with suggestions for how to improve your landscape. They also do those consultations earlier mentioned that will tell you, how you might be able to improve the efficiency of that irrigation system, or maybe you just only need to run it for 20 minutes as opposed to 30. And then they will, enforce those fines if you do happen to be watering on a day that you're not supposed to.
This has been very enlightening for me. This is not a topic that we get a lot of play on, I would say, on the podcast. But obviously water, just like food, this is something that affects everyone. This affects landowners, renters. This affects companies, corporations. So I'm really glad we were able to discuss this today. Any final thoughts before we say goodbye?
No, I just thank you for taking the time to ask these questions. And it's been a pleasure.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News writer Sarah Chavey for bringing attention to a topic, as I mentioned already, not really something we focus so much here on the podcast. So thanks, Sarah, for joining me on today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.